Welcome to the Grace Story Podcast, where inspiring stories are brought to life. This podcast is made possible by Grace College and Seminary, located on the shores of Winona Lake in the great state of Indiana. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Flam. This is the Grace Story Podcast.
But I am not your host, Drew Flam. I am Matt Harmon, joined in studio by my good friend, my colleague, and the man who could not get out of his driveway yesterday morning.
I couldn't.
John Scott Sloat.
Doc, this is not our podcast.
This is not our podcast. This is the...
What are we even doing?
We are executing a takeover. This is a takeover episode. We are co-hosts of the Various and Sundry podcast, and we have been asked, we were invited to take over the Grace Story podcast. So we should probably introduce ourselves a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Harmon. I've been here at Grace that's my 15th year. I teach in the School of Ministry Studies here at Grace College and Theological Seminary. I teach New Testament, I teach Greek. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, John?
Yeah, so I've been I also work at the seminary. I've been, how long have I been at the seminary? 3 years now. And I recruit and develop students in master's degrees that want to do their undergrad and master's degrees together and get those more efficiently. So the blended program is what we call that here. I also do some teaching in church history as well as introductory Greek. So we obviously work side by side quite a bit.
Yes, we do.
But one of the most exciting parts of my week, at least, is that you and I sit down once a week and record a podcast called Various and Sundry, a conversation between friends about theology, ministry, Bible, culture, and of course sports.
Yes.
Something we discuss. So if you're a listener to this podcast and you love the Grace Story podcast, but you're like, ooh, all those things sound interesting to me, head over to Apple, download us. We're also on YouTube. We have a Facebook page, Twitter page as well, so you can find us in all those places.
Yeah, we'd love to have you become part of the Various and Sundry podcast community, but we have someone else in the studio with us as well, so it's probably a good idea to introduce our guest.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. So we have the privilege today of introducing our good friend on the podcast known as Zach from Ohio.
That's right.
So he gets a few shout-outs here and there, but his full name is Zach Hess. He is a 2010 graduate of Grace College and a 2013 graduate of Grace Theological Seminary. So I like to say he did the blended program before the blended program was a thing.
When it was wildly inefficient and took 7 years.
I like to think of myself as a pioneer, and efficient as 7 instead of 5 years. That was great.
Yes, indeed. So Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys. Glad to be here with you.
And Zach is a good friend of ours. Zach, you actually were in school with John.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
John, our friendship goes back to probably freshman or sophomore year, then especially junior, senior year. We were doing stuff in the same youth ministry together in a local church, had some classes together, connections, and then
Day of Worship.
Day of Worship,
together.
which still happens at Grace, I believe, right?
Yes,
yeah.
So put together a coordinating team, and John was part of that for a couple of years, and that was probably where our friendship really began to take shape. But then in seminary was probably where that friendship really deepened and developed. And John, I think John's one of my best friends, certainly now.
Yeah, I got married this last year for the Grace Story podcast. If
Congratulations, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Way to say that publicly, even though we've said that in private like 1,000 times. Anyway, but if we hadn't had a pandemic wedding, Zach would have been my best man. So.
And John was invited.
Yeah, that's right.
To my wedding. I'm pretty sure he even RSVP'd.
I don't think I RSVP'd.
Okay, well, he was still a no-show regardless.
Yeah, I didn't go.
There's
no disputing.
Sarah and I have not forgotten that.
Yes. That I do remember the circumstances. But so, Zach, tell us a little about your family.
Yeah, so Sarah and I have been married for almost 11 years. So we got married right after I graduated. We have 3 kids. So Jake is 6 and should be at kindergarten right now as we speak. So he's loving that. Our second child is Caroline, who just recently turned 4, and she is the fireball of the family. Lots of fun, very
Has that
sweet.
beautiful curly hair.
Lots of curly hair. It's wonderful for Dad to brush. That does not go so well. But yeah, she's great and is she's our real energetic child. And then Kate, our newest, is almost 8 months old. And she's been our easiest kid so far. I don't know if our kids understand that she's the easiest, but she loves her siblings and is smiling and sitting up and growing a lot. So we're having a lot of fun.
Good. So tell us a little bit about your current ministry role.
Yeah. So I'm at Grace Polaris Church in the Westerville, Northern Columbus area.
Affectionately known on our podcast as the Mothership.
The mothership, yeah.
So right there in Columbus, Ohio, our church has been around for almost 60 years in that area, and was a really influential church in the region to start churches in that area, and has continued to serve, I think, as a influential church within our fellowship as well. So my role, I started there kind of in the middle of, or at the end of seminary, then right after seminary in 2013, was the young adults pastor there for several years. So working with college students, young professionals, doing a lot of premarital counseling as well, doing a lot of, officiating several weddings a year. And then over the last couple of years, that's transitioned to what we call as the training pastor, which is a glorified title for an associate pastor. And it kind of identifies what I do with, as training. I say, I teach people the Bible and how to read it for themselves. I teach people the gospel and how to share it with others. So that comes in classes, in small groups, training programs that you guys have both been so kind to come and teach a session of. So you've been able to see a little bit of what I do kind of on a regular basis. And then I also direct our pastoral internship program and our pastoral residency. So this is taking guys, who are in similar situations to what John and I were, coming out of seminary, looking for opportunities, have a lot of knowledge, but underexperienced. So trying to, I've heard as some people describe a church internship program like an ecclesiological boot camp, where we want to kind of, immerse somebody into the life and ministry of the local church. What are we going for? What does a healthy church really look like that's on mission, making disciples, preaching the word, faithfully, reaching a community for Christ and discipling their believers, so that a young guy can see that and then be more equipped to go be a pastor somewhere else. So I love that aspect of my job and having a lot of fun with it.
And that's how you and I have been able to partner even into our now early 30s.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you've been instrumental in making that program go.
Yeah, you guys are so old.
Yeah, we're so old. Yeah,
so old.
Yeah, we're knocking on death's door.
It's mid-30s is getting rough.
Yeah,
sure.
I've noticed some weight gain for myself, not for you.
Try to maintain a balanced diet somewhere.
Yeah, it's been tough getting old.
But on that issue, the blended program in particular has been wonderful. It's set up really well actually for a residency or an intern. For someone who's in their, third, fourth, fifth year to able, they have a lot of theological knowledge. They've been given great tools. I think, Dr. Harmon, you represent, I think even for John and I, a teacher who showed us how can we be fruitful in the local church? And yet seminary doesn't train you for the life of the local church. It's not supposed to. I don't think that's its design. But good internships and residencies are a way of, again, getting guys these opportunities to see, how do I take what I'm learning in New Testament theology or in Hebrew exegesis, and now apply that to the life of the church? They're not disconnected between the two. We don't need to drive this hard line between these two worlds. We actually see the blend. And I think one of the fun things for me is to watch these guys wrestle with various case studies or subjects, or to sit, on the outside of meetings and go, wow, I can see how this makes a difference. So out of our interns, the majority of them have been Grace students or grads. And so this partnership between, Grace Polaris Church and Grace Theological Seminary is really important to us and has proved, I think, continues to prove really effective.
Yeah, John, why don't you take just a brief, maybe like 30 seconds to describe for our listeners and viewers what the blended program is, so that we shouldn't assume necessarily that everyone knows what we mean when we say blended program.
Yeah, so when we say blended at Grace, that means during your undergraduate education, setting aside time and classes in order to work on a master's degree, in order to prepare yourself for a life of ministry. So that means taking systematic theology, taking historical theology while you're still in your undergrad, and doing it in a more efficient way than Zach and I did, where we each took 7 years to get through, taking 4 or 5 years to get through.
Yeah, it's very much designed to help accelerate the pace of theological education so that it saves students a lot of money down the road.
Thousands.
Yes.
$40,000+. It's incredible, the amount of savings that come through a program like the blended program.
Yes, and we are grateful for churches like Grace Polaris who partner with us, because one component of that is essentially an internship requirement. And I couldn't agree more, Zach, that too often there's this perception of a tension between the academy or the seminary and the church, as if they're competing, when in reality, I think both are needed. There are things that the seminary is best positioned to teach and train young people for ministry, whereas the church is also better positioned to give certain kinds of experience and pastoral opportunities that often are not really feasible for the seminary to provide. So it needs to be a partnership between the two.
Right. I remember as I was, I had finished my undergrad degree in biblical studies and was then planning to go to 3 years of seminary. And I remember being warned about, like, don't let your spiritual life dry up in seminary, because there was this, I think, and for some people that had been the case. I think this, and whether for whatever reason, but yeah, I mean, local churches typically don't teach Greek and Hebrew on an introductory level. There's not always the place, because pastoral ministry is oftentimes, trying to apply the word into the lives of people. You get caught up in a lot of pastoral situations that kind of don't allow for the kind of robust biblical theological discussion that seminaries are really supposed to have. And with experts, in New Testament and Old Testament and theology, that's just it's a world. It's not meant to be forever, for most people, but it's a world and a training opportunity that you can't replicate outside, oftentimes in the local church. So I'm thankful for a robust partnership in a school like Grace that has always emphasized the local church. I remember you talking about in your classes, whatever benefit to the academy that my writing or my teaching has, that's kind of a secondary aspect. We want to be, training people and benefiting the local church as priority. And I think that's a great goal that, this institution particularly has.
So, Zach, let's talk a little bit about maybe some specific ways that your education here at Grace, both your undergrad and your time here in the seminary, prepared you for the kind of ministry you're doing day in and day out today.
It took me probably just a few months to say, I can't imagine being in the local church without my MDiv. And that wasn't because I felt like I got some kind of special knowledge necessarily, but it equipped me with maybe not even the answer. I've said, it's not, seminary wasn't a walk through the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, where you memorized books of the Bible. And there's a benefit to programs like that, but it taught me to think theologically and to think biblically, so that when I encountered a pastoral or theological issue in the local church, I had the categories to be able to think through those things, even if I didn't immediately have the answer. So it trained a person. I think it shaped me to be able to be the kind of person who could think through those kinds of issues, to find the answer, to be and to be well researched and thoughtful about how I would approach various topics. So I think just from a formative standpoint, it was spiritually formational. Just out of it tested me, it tried me, it gave me just an experience in the Word that I'm just so thankful for. And then especially those tools that without the MDiv, I'm not sure I would have been able as equipped to make it happen. So again, thinking through how does biblical theology relate to systematic theology, for instance, and like shaping through how do we teach these kinds of things? Or you're wrestling with a person who even says, I want to grow in my prayer life. A question I just recently encountered. Well, not that you have to have seminary training to be able to answer those things, but I think the seminary training did equip me well to feel, to be prepared with an answer, as even Peter talks about.
Gotcha.
Zach, could you talk about what the process for you considering going to seminary was?
Yeah.
What was that process like, and what do you tell guys that are thinking about ministry in general, and what's some advice you give to
Right.
them?
Yeah. So growing up in the Grace Brethren Fellowship, Grace College and Seminary was, as far as I knew, the only Christian institution in seminary that even existed. So like for me, obviously Grace had it was a heritage. My parents went here. My pastors were Grace Seminary grads. So like for me, it was, you want to be a pastor, you go to Grace Seminary, which, and I'm thankful that it limited my options. Grace was the only school I even applied to. And, but I, in high school, kind of sensed this call to ministry, met Dave Plaster, former academic dean and professor here, at, youth conference that summer, earned a scholarship through some interview process with that. And that just, God continued to lead to, going in. I even switched. I was intending to be a secondary education major when I showed up, but I think my first day on campus, I switched to biblical studies because it was just,
Yeah.
So it was just, God continued to open up those kinds of doors. And just, so I think part of it was that call to ministry was, I want to be trained. I want to be equipped, and I want that opportunity. I didn't go to a Christian school, so I didn't have formal Bible classes like on an academic level. So it didn't take long for me to get even in the, kind of gen ed Bible classes to be just, I'm loving this. This is exactly what I sensed I wanted to do. And because, kind of going back to how did seminary equip me for the local church ministry? It was, where else do you get like this kind of narrow focus to be in the Word, to be talking about, theology, to be talking about how we understand the Bible, how we teach the Bible. So I think I ate it up because it was just, if this is what I want to do with my life, why wouldn't I spend extra time being trained for it? Sometimes we apply these kinds of things to the pastoral ministry that we don't to other spheres, like a teacher, for instance. With someone who's going to be a first grade teacher, a middle school teacher, a high school teacher, we expect them to have formal education that has trained them in theory and practice, that they've had student teaching that has helped, they've been able to apply that some places. But in pastoral ministry, sometimes we just kind of go, oh, you'll figure that out as you go. Or I remember even thinking this, or other students were, I just want to get in the ministry, and going like, no, in no other field of study do we typically just say, you'll just figure it out. So formal training, I think, is actually a really important aspect of it, because, again, it teaches us to think, not just what to think. And not that that's not an important aspect of it either, but I just think that narrow focus, specific time of life is really important for a lifetime of faithful and fruitful ministry.
Was there, when you came to Grace, was it always just, I'm going to go to seminary, or did that develop over time?
Yeah, so I remember a conversation with Dave Plaster. So as he was my mentor, and I was terrified of the languages. Okay, and that certainly wasn't my gift still, even in seminary. But I remember it's like, there's so many other resources out there. Is seminary really necessary? And he said, just do it. And he said, with the professors that are there now, they're training pastors to be able to use the languages in ways that will benefit their ministry. And he said, once you get your MDiv, essentially you'll have virtually anything that you really need. You can always go back later, for more stuff. But he was the one who said, just do it now while you're younger. Get it. And I remember, John, having classes with the guys who were married with families, and just, that was challenging, in that world to be able to go full time in a seminary. It's one thing to be taking a class or two, but to be able, those guys who were doing it full time were in just a challenging world. It was beneficial for them, but I think just to get it done was really helpful, because it helped lay a good foundation, and then to be able to come back to stuff later on, I think has proven fruitful.
Yeah.
So Zach, you've mentioned some of the ways that classwork helped you to prepare for ministry. As you think back to your time in seminary, what were some of the non-classroom experiences that were formative in your experience?
Yeah. Well, and these are the things you can't put in a price tag necessarily, but when you look back, these are the more formative, probably even the more formative things. I think about, two things that stick out was, John and Brent Mancarelli and I, oftentimes after class, multiple times a week, grabbing a pot of coffee, actually, and we would spend hours discussing what we were learning, how we were growing and stretching. We would challenge one another even in those things. And I think there was that sharpening aspect of outside the classroom where you might even I don't know if you were doing this intentionally, but you might start an argument that we would have later.
I can neither confirm nor deny that accusation.
And so I think the camaraderie with, and those friendships that have continued as part of that, I think are never could I have imagined those kinds of opportunities. And then mentor group in your home. In the relationship with you and other faculty, one of the things about a school like Grace that allows for that invites that kind of faculty and student interaction. I thrived in a situation like that. I wouldn't have done well in a larger group where I wouldn't have been able to, I can think of a number of times where I would go up what was McLean, the third floor of McLean, and knock on just someone's door with a question. And it was unplanned, no appointment made. But that kind of relationships were vital and again have remained. But I think, mentor group in your home, spending time with you and your family.
Often staying
way later
late than we intended. Sorry, Doc and Kate.
No worries, it was worth it.
But a lot of those formative decisions, like I remember, talking about proposing to Sarah in your guys' basement.
Yep.
I remember, you allowed us to do our laundry there when we were newlyweds, or just various. Talking through transitions, all those important things that are going on in that phase of life.
Yeah.
I could think about, the mentor group allowed to foster that kind of relationship. So along with those friendships, and then, I remember, golfing with Tiberius Ratza, and spending time together, and he's been able to, we've maintained a relationship. And so those are the kinds of things that I look back on it. My favorite memories, maybe it's not even probably one or two things that I shouldn't talk about because it's, foot and mouth disease that I can often have. And you guys, are remembering those things too.
Yeah. There are stories that are for the pod and stories that are for off the pod. Yeah.
But so outside of even some of those specific things, it's the tone, the relationships that were really formative here that I'm just, again, praise God for.
Well, towards the end of your seminary education, you had some significant circumstances that are pretty unique when it comes to just with your family and that sort of thing. So I wanted to have you tell a little bit about what that last year of seminary was like in light of, more importantly, what was going on in your family.
Yeah, so even to lead up to that, so Dave Plaster, who I've already mentioned, he, Sarah and I were, getting married in May of 2010. He passed away, relatively suddenly in March of that year. So, really important mentor to me. And so that's how I was ending college and starting seminary, was already a little bit with that loss. And I remember being in even Dr. Rotz's Genesis class and how just providentially what we were going through in Genesis was so helpful for me in processing that loss. Sarah and I got married in May. We all went to Israel together.
Yes, we did.
In January of 11, right?
That was such a great trip.
That was a great
I
trip.
forgot about that.
Yep.
Yeah, you're right.
One of the best pictures of that is actually you and I overlooking the Sea of Galilee,
that's
right there at Capernaum.
Yeah.
And so that was in January, and then in March of 2011, so it'll be 10 years ago actually, just in a month, Sarah's dad was diagnosed with brain cancer. And that was right in the middle of seminary. And so we immediately just kind of like launched us into this pretty deep, dark suffering and struggle. We were, traveling back and forth a lot just to visit and help out with family. And then as his condition continued to worsen, we made the decision to move back to Columbus. I think it was like a year left. I think I had 2 semesters left to finish when we did that, along those lines, something like that. But it was maybe 3. So it ended up being I would drove out here every week for a whole semester, once on Mondays, and then had a couple of online classes to finish up as part of my program. And at first I thought I was actually going to have to just press pause on seminary and just get a job in Columbus. But Grace Pillars Church offered, and they were saying if you guys are thinking about coming back, we'd provide an internship opportunity for you. I switched my program to exegetical. I was already thinking about switching from pastoral studies to exegetical studies anyways, and that allowed for
the listeners to more language work.
Right.
What you were initially terrified of. You wanted more
true.
of it.
That is true. It was amazing. Yeah, even how God had, I think, led in that time. It was even at the time, it was more focused time in the text that I wanted. But then it also allowed for independent studies that I would have been doing while I was here. And I remember the meeting with you in your office at McLean, and you said providentially, this is kind of a perfect spot for you to be able to do this. And I think those end that last half of seminary was marked by just personal loss and struggle as Sarah and I continue to process that. But at the same time, the classes that I was in was like, it was, when someone's suffering, where do we tell them to go? We go to the scriptures, and God is working through his word and through his spirit and through his people to testify to us. Not only were we involved in the local church and God's Holy Spirit was residing in us, but I just so happened to be in classes, just deep in the scripture. So when people talk about, the academic side of seminary can dry up your spiritual life, for me in my moment of suffering, that's exactly what I needed. And it's exactly what God used to continue to stir affections, to stir faithfulness, and for him to persevere me even through his word.
Good stuff.
That's great. Zach, at any time did you weigh either in this time of life with your father-in-law or even earlier in your studies, did you ever consider the Master of Arts degree, or was it Dave Plaster's pressing for the MDiv that really locked you in?
I don't even know if I knew there was a Master of Arts degree, quite frankly. I think so. I maybe signed up without having thought about it. I just thought seminary meant languages. I think the MDiv for me, I don't know if I really ever weighed the difference between an MDiv and an MA. I think it was just a go ahead and do it, and I'm glad I did, and because again, it's one of those where is the seminary well suited to serve pastors and churches? It's in stuff like the languages, and even with all the helps that are out there with, God rest, rest in peace Bible words. I don't think, that doesn't exist anymore. That's what we were trained under.
Yeah. Or a Logos school.
Or Logos I use now.
Yeah.
So as much as there are great resources that are there, I remember, just being told, taking the classes makes those things come alive. So even what I use the languages for, and I still use the languages, I think I'm dangerous enough, I think is what you might say, Dr. Harmon, to get around. But it still is the kind of thing where even if I'm not doing all the groundwork that I would have been doing in a Greek exegesis class, it still is enough that I'm like, okay, I can understand when I click that on Logos, that I understand how they got there or what's really going on there a little bit faster. Yeah. And it's really beneficial. So I'm thankful for the MDiv. It adds enough, I think, than the MA. And again, not to disparage the MA or anyone in it. Everybody has to make choices right for them. But I think if people are able to, I would say do the MDiv. Because that is, traditionally speaking, that was kind of the baseline for pastors anyways. Sure. And one of the things that I get a little concerned about kind of in, pastoral ministry in general is we're beginning, I think, at times to see formal theological education as a kind of the cherry on top instead of the foundation of the cake. And I think there needs to be a little bit more meat and potatoes, to mix metaphors there.
Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. We're all courses here, courses.
That's right.
But anyway, I think some of that robust theological discussion, even language discussion, that only helps pastors long term. And especially if someone imagines a long-term teaching opportunity, then if that's going to be the steady pattern of someone's ministry, then the MDiv makes just a lot of sense if people can do it. And the languages aren't as terrifying as I may have initially thought too.
And we do teach them in a way that we want to bring students along with us. It's not a make or break moment, but we want to help students understand them, and that's part of the heart in the seminary for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Doc, I want to transition to get Zach's sports feelings.
Yeah, let's get to the really important.
Okay. So a major part of the Various and Sundry podcast is we talk about sports a lot. You're a semi-regular listener. Is that a fair?
I would call myself a
regular listener.
I haven't listened to every episode, I must admit, but I am a regular listener to the Various and Sundry podcast.
Okay, so
we did get texted.
I listened this morning on my way.
This morning,
with some critical feedback.
Yeah,
from our latest episode there. So.
Zach, you know where we lie sports-wise. I'm mostly New York. Doc's mostly Ohio. Being in Columbus and growing up in Ohio, are you mostly an Ohio sports fan? And where are those allegiances?
Yeah, Ohio sports were are at the heart of it all. I'm admittedly not as rabid as an Ohio State fan as some are, but certainly follow the team and root for the team.
I'll accept that shade.
And Buckeye football was kind of always the thing. I grew up in the in the mid to late 90s with the Cleveland Indians being in their like World Series. So of course they never quite got that, but Omar Vizquel, Kenny Lofton, Roberto and Sandy Alomar, like those guys were like I had red cleats. I think like some of those guys. The Indians sold out for so many years in a row. And I remember like just as a middle or an elementary age kid getting tickets to sit in the nosebleed sections, like 3 rows from the top at what was then Jacobs Field, was like the pinnacle of life as you could ever think about it. I remember being at a high school football game one time while the Indians were in the World Series and they announced that Albert Bell had just hit a home run. So that was kind of the environment that I grew up in with them. The Cavs were a big deal. My brother had a basketball hoop in the barn. And Mark Price, number 25, was on the backboard.
A Cavs legend. Yes.
Exactly. He just had a birthday, I think, actually this week. So, so Ohio sports. I've always been just a miserable Browns fan. So I don't know if I actively root for the Browns, but it's one of those things where it's like it's part of the family. You just kind of have to. But we're taking this year as a step in the right direction, and who knows where things could be a little while from now.
Favorite player growing up? Who would you say you idolized as a
Omar
child?
Vizquel.
Omar Vizquel.
So the shortstop for the Cleveland Indians. He was my hero when it came to watching him making diving plays. I remember being in the yard with my dad and we'd be playing catch together, and I would just constantly say, "Make me dive." Like I wanted. So those were the kinds of things that I loved doing. And I played second base then, throughout I never had a strong enough arm to get on the other side of the second base. But playing middle infield, that was who I really wanted to emulate. But basketball was probably still my favorite sport. And Omar was the guy for me.
Now I do have to say that although we are in sync when it comes to our sports loyalties for the most part, there is one sports loyalty that you have that is just utterly befuddling to me, and that is that you are a Duke basketball fan.
I have to qualify that a touch. Okay, so it would be the one probably. Obviously as the Ohio State thing, you can't really say is a front runner thing if you're born into it.
Right.
Okay. Right. So, but Duke would probably be like the one, Duke basketball would be that one team that is just, I'll admit, is more of a front runner kind of thing. But for some reason, it's inherited as well. For some reason, my family had enjoyed and loved Duke basketball. Okay. I remember I had an aunt who lived in the Raleigh area for a long time as well. So as a little kid, we just walked into Cameron Indoor one time. Like I remember,
this is a different world. Man.
Yeah. So as a little kid, I remember we just walked into the middle of the court, just totally on our own. Like goodness. Someone walked out, we walked in. It was like we were walking into a high school gym somewhere. And then recently, we were in the Raleigh-Durham area a couple years ago as well, and we were visiting the Duke campus, beautiful campus. And it was myself, Sarah, her brother Matt, and my son Jake. This was a couple years ago, so he was still pretty little. And we were outside in that lobby, and they have like a museum essentially in the lobby of all these jerseys and whatever. Well, this guy walks down the steps, and he's about to walk out the door. Well, he turns around, and we're kind of like peeking in the one area that we couldn't get in at the time. And he saw Jake, of course, and he says, for the kid, we'll get you in there. He was like a VP of marketing in the athletics program. Huh. He goes, I'll give you 5 minutes. He gave us a half hour to walk around the court. It was awesome. I wish my son will never remember that story, but it was so cool to be. He took us around and all that. They were setting up for their end of year banquet that year as well. So that was really cool, especially something I had done as a little kid, and then to be able to do it as an adult was pretty neat. But I would still say I'm primarily a Buckeye fan. Even with basketball.
Yeah. Well, I can testify that you are raising your son properly. One of my favorite stories on that front is this would have been 2 falls ago, so 2 football seasons ago. It would have been the fall of 2019, I guess it would have been, I think. When we were visiting, I was doing something at Grace Polaris, I think, either preaching or doing something. And you managed to secure some Ohio State football tickets for myself and my youngest son, Jake. So, who, by the way, your son, Jake, thinks Big Jake,
affectionately called Big Jake.
Yeah, is like the greatest thing ever, which is fun to watch. But anyway, you had a golf commitment because we already mentioned that you're a golf coach.
A former golf coach. Okay. I've recently retired.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll circle back to that. But so you'd gotten us tickets, and so we decided to go to the Skull Session, which is a performance that the Ohio State Band puts on in Old St. John's Arena, which is the old basketball arena on campus.
Big pep rally a couple hours before the game. Yeah.
And the team comes in, and the coach usually speaks and fires up the crowd and that sort of thing. Well, so we only had tickets for the game for myself and my son Jake, but my wife was with us, your wife Sarah, and Jake was with us as well. And so we go to the Skull Session, and then we're walking out, and so my son Jake and I are walking towards the stadium. And it's at that point that your son Jake realizes, I'm not going to the football game with those guys. And he proceeds to, understandably, melt down.
I think your wife has called that maybe our worst parenting moment.
Well, no, I mean, so my wife had to help your wife get Jake back to the car because it was like a 15 or 20 minute walk back to where we had parked, and just to see the look on his face, like, what do you mean I'm not going into the football game with Big Jake?
Yep.
It was evidence to me that you had actually raised him right. That was actually a positive thing in my mind, because he was so upset he couldn't actually go to see the football game.
Our kids are certainly Buckeye fans. They sing the fight song regularly. Are the Buckeyes playing? We just watch we're getting to that age or that stage of life right now too, where he'll sit and watch games with me and stuff like that. So we're having a lot of fun. I'm excited for March Madness, Lord willing, to happen this year.
Yes.
And we'll watch a lot of sports together, I'm sure.
So we should probably circle back to the fact that we have a state championship winning
we didn't put that on the rundown.
Golf coach in our presence here. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I coached golf actually for 9 years. Wasn't much of a player. Anyone, especially who knows me from Grace days, would know I don't think Hess could play golf. But I enjoyed it enough. And when we moved back to Columbus, the middle school job was open at Worthington Christian. That's affiliated with our school or with our church. And my wife is a graduate, and brother-in-law is a graduate from there. And so the middle school golf job was open. I'm like, I like golf. I like kids, teaching etiquette and all that kind of stuff. And, so started in on that. Well, my second year, I had this group of kids come in and combined with another couple of kids who were just really, really good. And several of them are playing college golf, one here at Grace College as well. And just as those guys continue to develop and get better, in 2017, we won the Division III state championship in Ohio as a team. And it was just, so it was my first year actually as the varsity coach. So I was the middle school coach, JV coach, and then became the varsity coach that year. And it was awesome. I mean, it was really, really cool. Then the following year, had an individual state champion who is, who just played a phenomenal round. We missed going to state by 1 stroke that year. So our chance to repeat, which would have been an extremely good opportunity, we missed it just by 1 stroke. But this last year I finally wrapped that up. But had a lot of fun doing that. It was a fun way for me. I always wanted to coach. My dad has been a basketball coach for I think 30 years or so now. My brother's coached. So to be able to coach golf was a way of exercising, I think, something that I loved doing and all that. And recently coached my son's kindergarten and first grade basketball team this winter as well, which is very different than coaching anything.
Yes.
For sure. But yeah, coaching is a lot of fun.
Yeah, you will look back fondly on those memories as you get older. Like I look back and think about the opportunities I had to coach my own kids in basketball, and those were some of the best memories that I had with them. And not even so much about the performance on the floor, but just the time you get to spend in that kind of environment, from practices and that sort of stuff, and being able to teach some life lessons to not just your own kid, but other kids at that age as well.
And I think for me, I look at my job as a training pastor as a coach. So it's what I get to do, whether it's with pastoral interns, and so a lot of the discussions that we're having are in one level a coaching opportunity. So it's you go do that, to teach a lesson or to think through a case study, and then I want to help you think through ways to do that. One of the fun parts for me is actually seeing, guys in ministry be successful and faithful in ways that I'm sitting back watching them do it. But part of what I get to do is be part of their success, I hope, or for believers, in our church, faithful people who are serving in places, to resource them. I think as a coach is kind of how I tried to model my ministry. And then even, when I was coaching, those are opportunities to speak directly into a kid's life, that you don't always have the opportunity for it, it might be more of a finger in a chest opportunity, but then, not long later, it's the arm around the shoulder aspect. And those kids, those teenagers that I coach, those are, I always looked at them as more like little brothers to me, and really grateful for those opportunities. But I think coaching is a really good model for what ministry is supposed to be about as well. In Ephesians 4, when Paul says that he's given apostles, prophets, teachers, and shepherds, pastors, to equip the saints for the work of ministry. In a modern translation, we might say coach them, so that they're successful in the ministry that God has called them to. And so I think that blend for me in that world is really important. A good picture of what I tried to do with in my job.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I will often encourage seminary students and biblical studies students, that if you want to get a taste of what ministry is like, consider coaching. If you have any sort of connection with a sport where you can get involved, because ultimately one of the dynamics that I think comes out is when you're a coach, you realize you have to learn what motivates different players, different athletes. So with some guys, they aren't motivated unless you kind of get in their face and really get after them. But if you try that approach with another player or athlete, that might just shut them down entirely. So even just learning that dynamic that transfers over to ministry of some people need a little bit firmer confrontational style to get them motivated to grow or to develop, and others need a much more arm alongside of them, encouragement kind of approach as well. So I think coaching can definitely teach you that broader range of ability to connect with different types of people and learn how to motivate them.
And I think sometimes we just need more feedback. It's like, how often in our Christian life do we ask people for feedback? Hey, how could you, to ask a trusted friend or mentor, what areas of growth do you think I can have? And as younger pastors, and what I would say to seminary students, I think every seminary student upon graduation, and John, I'm sure you and I felt this too, we all thought, okay, now that I've graduated, I can go change the world, and that I have everything that I possibly need to be the next, famous whatever. Yeah. And it's like, so, rarely is the case that we're able to get good critical feedback for how can I teach better? How can I communicate better? How can I, lead a little bit better? And sometimes, in ministry situations where we only, depending on your church situation, the only critical feedback you have is some negative comment card from someone, from someone in the pew. And it's like, what we need is actually ministry coaches and friends to be able to do some of that for us. I'm thankful just to be on a staff where I'm able to receive, I think, feedback that's meant for my good, and I have to accept it as meant for my good. But a lot of times, I think guys are in situations where they're not being coached in ministry, and even so there's a ongoing development that we need. But then, as you're right, to how can you rather than seeing yourself as the pastor, as like the Bible answer man, or the, I'm just here to answer all of your issues. They're like, now how do I come alongside so that I'm equipping that person to live a faithful Christian life in a way that is like a coach, pointing out things of feedback, encouraging them where they need it, and then especially being that resource so that they can be successful.
Yeah. Well, this is the Grace Story podcast, but it is the Various and Sundry Takeover edition.
That's
and
right.
One of the things that we do on the Various and Sundry podcast is we name episodes in part after an athlete based on the episode number. And we did not talk about this.
We did not talk about
in
this.
advance.
I'm so curious as to where you're going right now.
And there's not an episode number attached to this necessarily. So I'm going to propose that we name this the Omar Vizquel
I like that
episode.
Okay. I like
now,
that a lot.
What number did
he was number 13, I believe.
Okay.
Number 13.
And he played in the late 90s into the 2000s?
Yeah, a little bit. So he didn't finish his career with the Indians, but he spent the bulk of his career with the Indians. I think he's managing now somewhere. He was with Detroit for a little while. So I've not followed him, his career forever, but yeah, he was part of those really successful Cleveland Indians teams in the mid to late 90s.
Gotcha. One other thing we do on the Various and Sundry podcast is we like to mention at the end of an episode one thing that we liked from that particular week. And it can be anything. It could be a meal. It could be a podcast. It could be a television show. It could be a book. It could be an experience. And so I know I didn't prep you for this, but
I was wondering if you were going to do it. So I actually on the drive out here today, I was like, I need to be prepared for something.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah, that's good. That's good. So I think, in fairness, we should probably all share a one thing we liked.
Yeah.
So if you have one ready, you can go ahead and get started.
So I just on Monday turned in my last assignment for another program that I'm in right now, and that felt like going back to undergrad days of like, the end of the semester and like, oh, I can breathe. Again, I know my wife was happy for me to be done with this class, but read so the one thing I liked it's over the course of the last couple months, but it's a book on the Holy Spirit by Andreas Kostenberger and Greg Allison, titled The Holy Spirit. So it's new out in 2020, but the first half of the book is Dr. Kostenberger going through essentially every reference to the Holy Spirit in the Bible. So a kind of a biblical look at the doctrine of the Holy Spirit from just every biblical text. And then Greg Allison on the second half of the book kind of deals with the doctrine of the Holy Spirit from a systematic theology idea. So this is, for pastors especially, I think, who are interested in like a one-stop shop, I think, on the doctrine of the Holy Spirit. Kostenberger and Allison's book, The Holy Spirit, is an excellent resource. So I've been recommending it quite a bit recently.
John, do you have one?
Yeah, mine's going to be far less spiritual. But today, for my beloved New York Mets, pitchers and catchers reported. We're sitting here right in the middle of February. So spring training has officially begun for my baseball team. So very excited about that.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go with a book that I am reading. Occasionally I like to read, actually more than occasionally, I like to read classics because I didn't necessarily read a lot of classic literature during my high school years. And my wife is an English and literature teacher at Lakeland Christian Academy, a local Christian high school in the area. And so I had been on a bit of a kick reading some John Steinbeck. I think I've mentioned that on the Various and Sundry podcast. But my wife has been after me to read Jane Eyre. So have either of you read Jane Eyre?
I have not read.
No.
Jane
Okay.
Eyre.
We're still learning.
Yeah.
You're always the teacher.
So I've been enjoying that, and I'm about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through. Okay. So a lot of interesting history woven into it, and even just some great themes of biblical fidelity and that sort of thing. So it's been good. It hasn't risen to the level of some of my affection for like East of Eden by Steinbeck and that sort of thing, but still a very good read. So all right, so are we ready to hit to hit the mission accomplished button here, John?
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, we have talked about our good friend Zach Hess, his ministry background, his background here at Grace College Theological Seminary. We've talked about his inexplicable love for Duke basketball.
Yep.
That's a little strong.
Okay. We have talked about his life lessons from seminary, some of the things that the Lord has taken him through in preparing for his current ministry at Grace Polaris. We've talked about his love for Omar Vizquel.
Omar Vizquel, yeah.
Yes, and we have talked as well about a book I'm reading, a book you're reading, and your beloved
Spring
Mets.
training,
So I think by definition, we have covered our various and sundry topics. Would you say?
I agree. Yes.
Yeah. So we appreciate your listening to us on this Takeover edition of the Grace Story podcast. If you would like to find out more about the Various and Sundry podcast, you can find us on the podcast app for Apple. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as well.
YouTube, Amazon, really anywhere you get podcasts.
Pretty much anywhere you get podcasts. So we'd love for you to check that out. And so I think at this point, all that's left to say is, until next time, the Lord bless you all real good.
Later.